incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is day 2 of this April 2017 session here at Mountain Gate on an extremely windy day. It is said that there's a cold front coming through and it's supposed to drop 10 to 15 degrees this weekend. Hopefully it won't freeze our fruit tree blossoms. Yamada Mitra-roshi was the teacher of Mitra-roshi, abbot of Sogenji in Okayama, Japan, and Tahoma Monastery in Whidbey Island, Washington, in the United States. Yamada Koun-roshi was the Dharma successor of Yasutani Roshi, who was Haku-un Yasutani, who was the Dharma successor of Dai-un Sogaku Harada Roshi, who was then abbot of Hoshinji in Omama, Japan. And you notice this similarity in their names, Dai-un, Haku-un, and Ko-un. Un is cloud. So Dai-un Roshi was Great Cloud Roshi, and Haku-un Roshi is White Cloud. And I'm not quite sure what Ko-un Roshi's characters are, so I don't know which cloud he was, but it appears that the cloud name has carried down through that particular lineage. And it was Yamada Koun Roshi who inherited Yasutani Roshi's Dharma as the primary successor. Now, another successor of Haku-un Yasutani Roshi was Philip Kapleau Roshi. And he and Yamada Koun were training side by side at in Kamakura under Yasutani Roshi in the old days before Kapleau Roshi came to the United States and established the Rochester Zen Center. Koun Roshi, who actually was a lay person, in fact he was a hospital administrator. His wife was the head doctor at a private hospital, and their hospitals in Japan are mostly private hospitals. They're sort of established and run by the doctors that are heading them. And so his wife was the main doctor at the hospital, and he was the hospital administrator. When I was living at Sogenji, I was going to a little hospital, same kind of thing, for various different things. And the hospital administrator in that case was the doctor's wife. There are some bigger hospitals in Japan, but a lot of the hospitals are a little private. Really, we might almost call them clinics. And the successor for Koun Roshi is his son, who is now heading what is known as Sambo Zen. Koun Roshi established Sambo Kyodan, which name was eventually changed to Sambo Zen. And we have right here in New Mexico a Dharma successor of Koun Roshi, who is Joan Rick, who is retired and living in Albuquerque. We on occasion will have lunch together, although a little bit more rarely than I think either of us would prefer. At any rate, this is the style of Zen that is an amalgam of Rinzai and Soto. It is what is called nominally Soto, because Harada Daiun Sogaku Roshi was a Soto Zen monk, and yet he was not satisfied with the quality of teaching or the depth of teaching in the Soto sect in his era, and so trained for many years in Rinzai temples. And this is why, this is partly why the other part of it is Harada Roshi, the other Harada Roshi, why we can teach Rinzai koans in the Rinzai traditional manner here at Mountain Gate and also at Hidden Valley Zen Center and also at Turtleback Zendo, our three zendos. Yamada Koen-roshi was featured in the Three Pillars of Zen, which he assisted assisted Kapler-roshi in some of the translations, namely the translations of the Basui teachings. I think there was one other thing that he helped with. At any rate, within the Three Pillars of Zen is a whole chapter entitled Enlightenment Stories. And one of those enlightenment stories is that of Koen Yamada, who was not yet Roshi, but who had been doing deep zazen under Gyatso Roshi, and he must have been at home because his son, who was 10 years old at the time, was there present, and before he got home, he was commuting back home on the train, and he was reading or recalling some of the words of Dogen. And in the middle of the night, he woke up, and they suddenly turned into a very deep kensho for him. And of course, even though in some places this is called a deep enlightenment experience with reference to his particular experience, nonetheless, it doesn't matter how deep our so-called awakening is unless we are able to transform our lives to express it 100%. A person can have had a Kensho experience, and I've known a number of them, unfortunately, and still be able to go through many koans, past many koans, and yet their life is still the same life it was, in the sense of the dysfunction that they carried with them into their practice, because they didn't understand or somehow weren't able to or willing to do it. This what is called long maturation, where we embody our awakening, because an opening that would be called Kensho or Satori or awakening is a sudden parting of a veil, a pretty thick veil usually, but it is a parting of the veil, so that suddenly we see far more clearly, far more deeply, far more let go for a brief period of time. It may be a longer period of time. In the case of Jacques Lusseran, who had a very deep awakening experience at Buchenwald, the concentration camp in Germany during the Second World War, and found joy, and it never left him, that says that his awakening was extremely deep. The fact that decades later, his university students, and I think it was at the University of Hawaii, asked him how he had become who he was, in the sense of how did he get to be this clear, compassionate human being, unusually clear and unusually compassionate human being. And he told them about his experiences. And the fact that he was still appearing that way and still feeling that joy does say that his awakening experience was quite deep. And the same way with Flora Courtois, who also had a deep awakening experience when she was a college student at the University of Michigan, and didn't encounter Zen for almost 2 decades afterwards. Eventually, as you already have heard, she found herself in the living room of Alan Watts, part of his little group of people that he was speaking with on a regular basis, and suddenly began to realize that this enlightenment experience that they were all talking about was something that she had actually experienced. And eventually she found Mayazumi, who eventually became a Roshi, and trained with him. But up until that time, that experience was still alive for her. And this was verified by Yasutani Roshi when he met her personally and heard her story and was able to ask her questions and just check on her demeanor. Because when somebody has had a deep awakening experience, it's obvious to someone with a trained eye. And of course, this is what is most important, is not just the experience, but that we are able to expand it and deepen it, and to bring it to life. Letting go our negative habit patterns as we are opening to them, because this parting of the veil, that even though it will be likely temporary, because most people only have a small kensho these days, still that there's a level of seeing more clearly that sticks with us, and it allows us to see more clearly, as Zazen in general does, if we're willing to pay attention, where we are caught, where we are acting out of conditioning, where we are reacting to situations rather than responding to situations. And this is the enormous benefit of our Zazen, if we go about it in the way it's meant to be gone about. To be able to attend sesshin, as we are here today, is an enormous gift in that direction. And we have a beautiful little zendo here of deep, quiet, open, clear energy that assists us in our search for, our search for who we really are. And that's what we are searching for. I'd like to share with you now some of the words of Yamada Koun Roshi in a book called Zen, the Authentic Gate. It was translated into English, although I think that Yamada Koun Roshi actually spoke English. The first chapter begins with suffering, human suffering, which of course is the basis of Zazen. This is what motivated the Buddha, or the person that became the Buddha, to search deeply within himself. First outside himself, and then when he realized that was not going to bring him answers to his deep and disturbing questions of why is there suffering? Why are we born? And only if we last long enough, get old, get sick, die. Is that all there is to life? Why? And first he went out once he had what are known as the four sights. Had seen an old person, a sick person, a corpse, and a person of spiritual training. He left his home and went into the jungles and began ascetic training, which is what the abiding religion of the day taught. Mortifying the body, you can come to some level of awakening or understanding. I don't know the details of it, but at least that was what he started out doing. did it for 6 years, and then close to the point of death, he decided this is not going to work. I've got to start eating again, because if I die, I won't have my answers. And so then he began to eat again, and that's when he sat down under the Bodhi tree, and vowed not to get up until he did have his answers. And this is the depth of conviction, this is the depth of commitment that we need to have in our zazen in order to have a kensho experience. Of course, it takes a while, because we're not accustomed to sitting zazen, we're not accustomed to using our mind in the way that we do. And we're having, for some time, however short or however long, depending on any number of factors, including our experience and our history and our level of determination, we're up against all the temptations to do otherwise. And there are certainly plenty in this day and age. Everyone wants pleasure, everyone wants joy, everyone wants happiness. And we don't realize that in searching for happiness, we're opening to the full range of feelings. We can't get happiness without also being open to experience sadness and anger and all the other emotions. Now, there is a book that's come out fairly recently called How Emotions Are Made, the Hidden Life of the Brain. It is very, very important for people who do Zen practice to take a look at that book, because it actually verifies scientifically what the Buddha discovered in his awakening experience, that our negative feelings, our emotions in general, arise as a result of our conditioning. We're conditioned to view certain experiences, certain things happening, negatively or positively, whichever. And of course we want the positive ones, we don't want the negative ones. Who wants suffering? It's interesting, I recently had an email from a student who works helping to take care of people who are institutionalized because they need that level of care. And she was despairing because she was so sad about the condition of the people that she was taking care of, that she found it actually hard to work with them. And what she didn't realize is that her ideas about their condition were getting in her way. That's why she was so sad. It's important to recognize that there's all kinds of experiences for human beings and all kinds of conditions that human beings find themselves in. And to broad brush it and say, somebody that's blind or deaf or missing parts or deathly ill from this, that, or the other, or brain damaged, or any of the other kinds of things that can happen to human beings, that it is a disaster, that it is so sad, that it is an awful situation. Well, we just can't really know. That could be of tremendous benefit. Think about Jacques Lejeune, for example, who, when he was 8 years old, was rushing out to recess along with all the other kids and got shoved, most likely accidentally, from behind, and it sent him careening into the corner of the teacher's desk. And all of a sudden then, and he was wearing glasses at the time. In those days they did not have glasses that were break resistant. And so they broke, and that was the end of his eyes. And from then on he was blind. But when he ended up at age 19 in Buchenwald, and before that, when he was earlier in high school, and he and his buddies decided the Germans having invaded France and were terrifying and disappearing the French people. They decided that they needed to do something about that, and the thing that would be most effective would be to get to the French public authentic, true news, because the German propaganda machine was telling them all sorts of lies, and that was a part of the source of their terror. And so they formed little resistant groups and listened to clandestine radio and printed up a little newspaper every 2 weeks and peddled it all over France in their bicycles. And for 2 years they were quite successful in counteracting that propaganda. And then one person gave them away, not the whole group. The whole group by then was 500 kids. But they had established it from the beginning in a way that there were cells, and within each cell people knew who each other were, but only Jacques knew who everybody was, because he was the person that everybody had to come to be interviewed, and he would give a yes or a no in terms of whether they could be accepted, whether he felt they were trustworthy, because he had developed a great deal of intuition as a result of his blindness. So that became a gift. And then when he was in Buchenwald, and people would steal his bread because he was blind, and they were so desperate. They were all starving, and so anything they could do to get a few extra crumbs themselves to try to survive, they were willing to do. And eventually he became so ill he was dying. But in the midst of that, because how he responded to it, he had a profound awakening experience. And it changed him again in profound ways, so that people regularly led him to others in the camp who were freaking out, who were terrified, because he could bring them peace, really. There's a koan about Bodhidharma when he was in China finally, and Ekadaishi, who became his primary successor, came to him. Ekadaishi had been 30 years studying the sutras, trying to find some level of peace for himself. And finally he heard about Bodhidharma, who was the first person known, and actually this is possible, that Bodhidharma himself as a discrete person didn't exist, that it may be a composite of several people. At any rate, assuming Bodhidharma did exist, Bodhidharma is credited with being the first person who brought actual meditation to China. Buddhism had reached China 300 years prior to Bodhidharma's arrival, but it was a study of the sutras, of the words of the Buddha, and there was no real Zen practice, no meditation practice. And so Bodhidharma is considered the first patriarch in China of Zen. And so Ekadaishi appears, in the legend goes that it was winter, it was snowing. Bodhidharma was sitting facing the rock wall in this cave that he was living in at the time, and ignoring Ekadaishi. And finally, all night long, Ekadaishi stood there in the snow, pleading for some help. And finally, so it goes, he pulled out a knife and cut off his arm to demonstrate his sincerity and his desperation, I guess, in requesting guidance from Bodhidharma. And finally Bodhidharma turned around and said, "What do you want?" And he said, "My mind is not at peace. Please, please, give it peace." And Bodhidharma said, "Bring me your mind and I'll give it peace." And after quite a long time, Ekadaishi said, "I can't find it." And Bodhidharma said, there, I've given it peace. What did he mean by that? We have thoughts and ideas floating through our mind, some of them snagging onto us tenaciously. What happens when they're not there? Or what happens when there's a pleasant thought there? What's the state of our mind then? In our Zazen, we work to let go all of our attachments, little by little. This is a tall order, so that our mind can be clear and unattached and so unskewed by anything, so that we are free to respond to circumstances. We're not caught in knee-jerk reactions that are driven by our conditioning. And this is partly why it takes a while to do Zazen before we come to awakening. It's exceedingly rare for anyone either to have a spontaneous awakening, as Flora Courtois did, although it wasn't exactly spontaneous because she had been questioning, searching for truth that was true regardless of circumstances ever since she was a young teenager. So in that sense, it wasn't exactly a spontaneous awakening. With Jacques Lassalle, he had plenty of time in Buchenwald to be caught in the question of suffering before he was able to come to a profound awakening. So it's not really certain that either of these circumstances were spontaneous. Spontaneous in the sense that they suddenly occurred, but not necessarily spontaneous in the sense that there was nothing working in the background to bring them forth. And the same is true of the man who became the sixth patriarch, who is said to have had a spontaneous awakening when he was 19 years old, I guess. But in his case, when he was 3, his father had died. His mother was illiterate, even though his father was high enough in government circles, which meant he was highly educated, to be banned to the frontiers. And there he married a woman who was a local woman, and they had a son. And then he died. And so the sixth patriarch to become, and from the time he was a tiny child, helped his mother by going into the woods and picking up sticks so that she could sell wood for firewood and earn enough money to eat and feed her son. So he had plenty of time out in the woods. He had plenty of time to consider the grief at losing his father and the hardship that his mother was going through, and whatever else was going on in China and that part of China in that era. And so when he had what is considered a spontaneous awakening on hearing part of the Dhamma Sutra, it's a question as well whether it really was truly spontaneous in the sense that it suddenly came out of nowhere with no preparation. It did come out of nowhere with a trigger, and the trigger was hearing the sentence from the Diamond Sutra that says, "Arouse the mind that abides nowhere. Arouse the mind that abides nowhere." And that's the mind that's not caught in conditioning. That's the mind that doesn't get caught in anger or sadness or rage or whatever else, including happiness. It is able to freely respond in each moment to circumstances, and that is a freedom beyond anything we can calculate. So now to Yamada Koen Roshi's first chapter, which is titled Suffering and Modern Day Humanity. When pondering the suffering of humanity in the modern world, it may be helpful to remember that it was in quest for deliverance from what he called the four sufferings, birth, death, sickness, and aging, that Shakyamuni left home to seek the way more than 2,000 years ago. Suffering was not unique to his time. Humans have always lived out their lives in suffering. Buddhist terminology refers to this world as saha, a Sanskrit expression which could be translated as, quote, the world of enduring, or, quote, the land of bearing indignities. The world of enduring. The land of bearing indignities. How easily it is to feel insulted. How easily it is to feel threatened. How easily it is to feel less than. Here we are living in the Saha world. But it doesn't mean that we have to be colored by it. And this is important. When we do our Zazen, we are little by little, every time we extend that out breath, we are learning more and more completely the process of letting go, practicing it really. And as we do this on a regular basis over and over again, we begin to see in our daily life that we're not quite as caught as we were before we ever started doing Zazen. We're able to see a little bit more clearly. Of course, seeing a bit more clearly means we're going to see a bit more clearly also where we're caught. We have been largely ignorant of it in general before we did Zazen, and now it can actually feel like we're getting to be worse, but we're not. We're becoming more aware, and that's vital to becoming free of it, because we can become free of it. And the Zazen, when it is pursued relentlessly, when we give ourselves truly, deeply to this practice, resisting the temptation to be drawn away by interesting thoughts. Just one thought? Well, just one thought doesn't happen. Suddenly you're far, far away from your practice. A multitude of thoughts later. Don't entertain that one thought. It's going to lead you far away. It's not so easy to do Zen practice. But when we are willing to do what's called for in doing it, it is incredible the freedom that we can open to, our innate freedom. Our freedom from being caught by greed, anger, and delusion. Our freedom from being caught in suffering. Our freedom from creating suffering for ourselves or for others. That's the only real freedom there is. And so, when we have been able to reach that level of freedom, it won't matter if we're in concentration camp. It won't matter what our life circumstances are, because we won't be caught by them. We'll be able to function through compassion and wisdom fully, and there won't be a problem. This is the gift of our Zazen. But we can't do average Zazen in order to get there. Average Zazen won't take us there. It has to be, as Mitra-roshi says, life on the line Zazen. Life on the line Zazen. Willing to risk everything to do that Zazen fully. And willing to risk everything really means, as we're sitting on the mat or in the chair or wherever we're doing our Zazen, that we don't let temptation draw us away to other thoughts, to dreams, to ideas, or to settling down into our misery. It means we give ourselves so fully to that practice, when we're doing that practice, that we disappear. Who we think we are disappears. There is only the practice, there's only the extended out breath, the reaching for the truth, the letting go without any idea of letting go. This is our deep zazen. This is what is essential to truly become awakened, to truly be able to offer ourselves to the relief of suffering of humanity, because this is a time when suffering is ramping up. There's so much displacement in the world, so much starvation, so much rage, so much violence, so much prejudice, so much insanity in the world today, so that compassion and wisdom are caught in this turmoil of hatred and greed. Our zazen has never been more important than right here now. So we haven't gotten very far in Yamada Koen-roshi's talk, but that's okay. The important thing really is to dive in, not to look left, not to look right, just dive. Dare to go beyond where you've gone before. Risk it. You won't be disappointed. It's worth it. So please take care of yourselves and do it deeply. Thank you for listening, and we'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.